Somehow I had it in my head that this was one of the sessions with 2 papers and not 3. In my defense, I have a 2-year-old. So my brain is very confused a lot of the time. So we now have Peter Schott doing Colocation of Production Innovation, Evidence from the United States, which is obviously related to the other pair in sort of an obvious way. Is like, okay, if you're trying to do place-based policies, why would you want to, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to think about production innovation, things like that? So that's underlying it. So papers along with Teresa Fort, Wolfgang Keller, Stephen Yapel, and Nicholas Zolas. So please.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Similar, I guess, since I was trying to think how this paper fits with this session. Partly it refers back to Erica's keynote in the sense that I'm going to be talking a lot about bringing some data to bear on a question I think that's quite interesting. And then it relates to Gordon's in that we're not quite finished yet. We're doing a whole bunch of data gathering, and so we have some interesting messages, I think, and I'd like to show those to you. And then, of course, across all 3, there's a geographic, a spatial component to what I'll be talking about. Okay, so census data. So here's the usual disclaimer. So why are we looking at this? What's the motivation? Historically, and when I say historically for us, we can go back, I'll say more about this in a minute, we can go back to the 1970s, the mid-1970s. Manufacturing firms have dominated patenting. I'm going to be talking about patents today. I'll say more about this later. I'm going to think about patenting as a decent manifestation of innovation. And so manufacturing firms have dominated patenting. And then, as probably most of us are aware, manufacturing employment and manufacturing establishments have been in decline over the last 20 years. It's not true of manufacturing really value added, but it is true of the location of the production jobs. And so here's just a little bit of data to bring that to bear. I've cut it off. Manufacturing rises, of course, in the post-war period. The peak is in 1979. This is employment. You get U.S. changing trade policy with China when China enters WTO, and that is followed by a big drop. And then, of course, there's another big hit, which is the Great Recession. So manufacturing employment takes a hit, doesn't recover, won't recover. And then this is a maybe less well-known series. This comes from the business dynamic statistics that are available publicly. This is the number of manufacturing establishments in the United States, and you'll see there's also that very sharp decline. And so there's this concern out there that if the manufacturing jobs go, if the manufacturing establishments go, so will the innovation. I tried to do a little interdisciplinary stuff on my own. So these are from 2 engineers who have a policy institute. And they have this summary quote. It's not hard to find quotes like this, as I'm sure many of you are aware. Once manufacturing departs from a country's shores, the know-how, the engineering, the ability to think of the next thing goes away. And so that's a strong statement. And I will say, as a trade economist, when I go and give public lectures and I espouse the benefits of free trade, I'm often accosted at the end of the presentation, you're an idiot, you don't really understand that all the innovation will go away. And so I've really wanted to look at this question for a long time. I think it's like super interesting. And so we're going to try and take a step in that direction. And the initial part of this research effort will be to create the data infrastructure that allow us to do that. So I'll take you through that. Okay, there's also a broader context for this. Nick Bloom and co-authors have this nice paper where they make the claim that ideas are, in general, getting harder to find. And so if you could think about this, what we're doing is maybe a component of that, or you could think about this as being another way in which that's might be playing out. So I'll maybe say more about that towards the end, but there's this backdrop about where does innovation come from and is it getting harder? And I guess it relates to some of what Erica said about Moore's Law, et cetera. Okay, so we're going to start with a simple question, and the simple question is, does the co-location of R&D and or some measure of inquiry that leads to ideas, is that related to innovation? And we'll use today the measure of patents. And so two basic pieces have to come together in order to do this. So let me show you the kind of punchlines in terms of what I'll show you, and then I'll tell you how we kind of found those things. So first, in terms of data, there's 2 big pieces. One big piece is understanding information about innovation, so that's patents. And the other is taking US Census data that, not the people side of the census data, but the firm side of the census data that tracks all, basically all private US establishments. For the firm level data, census data is really good. It's been used in many, many, many studies. There's always been some location information in the census data, but it hasn't been systematically cleaned out and put in for all establishments. So we go back to the kind of native data set that the census data are derived from, and we've geocoded that in terms of latitude and longitude, so you'll see why that becomes relevant. And then another thing we've done is we've taken the US patent data, which are publicly available and contain information about the assignees and the inventors, and we've matched that to the firms in the census. Of course, the patent data have been matched to firms in a publicly available data set, CompuStat, and there's lots of papers. Gordon, for example, has nice work on this. But that hits the very big firms, and so what we're trying to do here is, if we want to look about innovation in the US economy more broadly, let's match the patents to all of the firms in the US. So that also took quite a bit of time. This paper, you'll see this working paper is quite old. One reason is this matching took a while. But it's done now, and so we're starting to use it. It's done better than I think it was in the first version of the paper. Okay, and then what are the results? It does look like there is an association. Everything I'm going to show you today is descriptive. We don't have a fancy identification strategy. We have some ideas. Maybe we can talk about those later. But descriptively, both production firms patent more in the data. You see more patenting by firms that have both innovation and production establishments. And if you drill down a little bit and look only at the firms that have both of those establishments, the ones that have those establishments closest together also patent more. So it's kind of interesting finding. So the rest of the talk is just kind of taking you through how we found that, how we know that. Okay, so first on the data, in case you don't know the census data, there's this backbone data set. It's called the LBD, the Longitudinal Business Database. This basically tracks all US establishments from nowadays it goes from 77 to 2020. I think 2021 might have just been released. Establishments are plants, I'll use those synonymously, and firms are collections of establishments. So the LBD also has firm identifiers that allow you to track which firms have which establishments over time. That's going to be useful for us because we want to think about co-location of different types of establishments. How do we know what the establishments do? There are these NAICS codes, industry codes, that Fort and Klimek have kind of done a lot of work on making those industry codes consistent over this very long period. That's not trivial because there was a big change in systems between SIC and NAICS. You may not care about that. I love that kind of stuff, but you may not care about that. But it's really important because the way that innovation establishments were tracked under the SIC is very different than under NAICS. And so in some sense, that contribution is really critical here because in the past, an R&D facility at a manufacturing firm would have been classified as a manufacturing establishment. And that's not true anymore, so we're able to tease these out more cleanly. Okay, so we know where the plants are located. I told you that. There's economic censuses that'll give us a bit more information. LBD is really good for like every year, where they are, what's the employment, what do they do. EC adds in on every 5 years, things like what are the sales, a bit more data on, for manufacturing firms on inputs. And then we can match the firms that show up with trade. I'm not going to do a lot with trade today, but I'll show you, if I have time at the end, a little bit of a teaser, what we could do. And then, okay, so we're going to use patents today, but patents are both great and have like all data, they're good and bad. They have good qualities and bad qualities. It turns out there's a lot of information in the forms that firms fill out for the census that allude to or capture different aspects of innovation. And so part of this project is also gathering the answers to those not very well, not so far up till now, not quite intensively analyzed data fields and trying to bring them in. I don't have anything disclosed on that yet, so I can't show you that today. But we are aware that it'd be nice to have a kind of constellation of innovation measures as opposed to just patents. Okay, those things come from, if you want to know, those come from the CERD and the BERDIS, which are these two surveys that Census does. Not censuses, they're surveys, so there's also differences. There's liabilities in using the survey information as well. Okay, and then on the patent side, we have the PTO, patent office data. That tells us the location of assignees and inventors. We use the assignee information to match it to firms, and we use the inventor information for regional analysis that also is not yet disclosed, but I'll allude to when I get to that point of the analysis. And then the paper that's linked is really going to split into a couple things, at least a couple things. One is this effort for the bridge. So this bridge was been done by a slightly different research team. And so that's the one that matches the patents to all private firms. The match rate's actually pretty good for domestic patents, upwards of 90, close to 100%. The thing that's hard to match are when it's a foreign patent, which is we would define as a patent that has no assignees that are located in the United States. Okay. All right, so just some data. These are US patent grants that are matched in our data. I'm not showing you the match rates, we didn't disclose that yet, but these are the match series. You might be worried about that little hook there at the end, but that's just because in this version of the paper, we've reached the end. And of course, there's a gap between when you apply for a patent and when you get the patent. That's not going to affect anything I'm going to show you. We'll take care of that. And then I'm not, as I said, I won't do much with R&D, but from those R&D surveys, I can do the same thing for the firms in the survey. I can add up the R&D that the firms respond doing. This is where the public information on US R&D and the national accounts comes from. They have these weights in there that allow you to gross it up to the total. Most of those weights, interestingly, are near 1. But anyway, this is what the series would look like. So in the future, we'll do more with R&D, but for now, we're just doing patent information. Sure.
Is this million or billion, and this referred to firm or industry?
These are both aggregate, and that's wrong. That should be, I'm pretty sure that's billion, but I'd have to double check. Sometimes when I'm on this side of the microphone, I can't remember very well, and I'm better when I'm on that side. That's too small. It has to be billion. Yeah. 300 billion, yeah, in that end year. Yeah. So, and these are not, yeah, I have to check if these are nominal too or not. I'm sorry, I switched it now. It senses everything's real, but I think in this version of the paper, things are still nominal. So, okay. Good. All right, so for answering that question, we need to know something about plant types. Manufacturing plants are easy. They have a NAICS code that begins with 3, okay? There's a historical reason why we call these P. You might think of calling them I for innovation plants or R for research plants, but they're called P for now, and it's hard to change that in the short run. Why did we call them P? We call them P because professional services is the NAICS category in which research and development sits. And you could use a very narrow definition of an innovation plant, which is an R&D plant. That turns out to have a NAICS code of 5417. But for this version of the paper, we went a little more broad, and that was partly discussing with people who kind of thought what would be reasonable. Everything I show you for these bigger things, I could also more or less show you for R&D. Yeah?
So are R&D labs, does that include national labs, or that's a separate?
So we're doing, no. So what we have is the R&D labs of privately owned firms in the LBD. Okay, so what else? What is that broader set? Engineering, design, everything listed. Those all are, if you'll notice, those are all in 54. 54 is that professional services category. There's another category here you might have heard of, the headquarters, sometimes they're described as, but they're also management. That's NAICS 55. And NAICS 55 is just 2 or more 54s. So a management headquarters could be, that's where the CEO sits, but it could be that's where the accounting department and an R&D lab are. So that's the reason for including headquarters. And then we pull some from 51, which is where some of the information technology stuff happens. Anyway, so we have this broad set for today. Yeah?
Isn't 51 certainly software more copyrighted than patented?
Yeah, so we're just thinking, though, where do I, plausibly, where would ideas for some innovation come from? And so that's why we've included that. We could also look at copyrights. We've also, we're now matching the trademark data. So yeah, we're sympathetic to that. So that's M and P. M is manufacturing, P is innovation, professional. And so firm types, when I show you things by firm type, you can be an M firm. That means you have a manufacturing plant. You could be a P firm. That means you have one of those innovation facilities, but not the other, right? And you could be both. You could have M and P, and that was kind of captured. That's the group we want to look at in particular to capture that answer to that question. Did you have a question? And then what's the left out group? The left out group is firms that have neither of those facilities. Okay? All right. So just a little, what do these look like? So M&P firms, how many, how important are those in the U.S. economy? If you look at the scale here, they're a very, very small share of the U.S. economy, right? 1.5% over the period that we're looking at. They're small in number, but they're big in employment. That's probably not surprising. You have GM in there, et cetera. I don't know that from the census data. I only know that from reading the newspaper, because I'm being televised. So but they're a declining share. Why are they declining share? Because manufacturing employment is falling. And if you think about like I said earlier when I alluded to the dominance of patenting, MNP firms dominate US patenting. About 80% of patents come from these firms. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. You'll notice everything here is ending at 2012. So we did this analysis through 2012. We missed that hook when the grants go down. The new version of the paper will go all the way to 2020. So we're trying to extend that. Yeah?
So innovation on the side of manufacturing firm will be still classified as M only?
Say that again?
Two questions. One is, for firms that do innovation on the side of manufacturing firm, it is like that, just on the same side.
Yeah, you mean in the plant?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They will be classified as M only.
They'll be classified as M only. We have some degree that we've been playing around with. We can see within an M whether you have production and non-production workers, but we don't necessarily.
Or if you have a P that's outside the US, so we also classify.
Right. So we also don't get to see if you have a P outside the US. We have ways we might be able to address that going forward.
The patent like innovators, they have address. We will be able to say whichever site that has patent innovators address.
Yeah.
Will be classified as innovation.
So we do observe the inventors from the patent data, we know where the inventors live. And in work I've done but can't show you today yet, we have assigned the inventors to the plausibly closest plant to where they live. And that's a way for us to kind of assign the inventors to a particular establishment. Is that what you're?
I'm saying, are there M only firms that still have employees that do not need patents?
Oh, M only firms patent for sure. Yeah, M only.
They will allow you to classify M as potential P.
That would allow us to do that. Yeah, we could take the stand and say, if you have a patent, you must have had R&D. Yeah, but that might be a strong assumption. But yeah, we could do that. I'll show you a bit more about that as we go. Okay. I don't know if you need an example. Like, this is a public example. Bristol Myers Squibb, a pharmaceutical company. They have headquarters, which remember are collections of 54s. Those are the ones that are purple. They have R&D labs around New Jersey, and they have manufacturing facilities in the Northeast and in Puerto Rico, not uncommon for a particular company. So what's our research question here? You know, in a nutshell, does having both these kinds of plants facilitate innovation? And if you have them closer together, as opposed to imagine these weren't close together and you only had them far apart, would you notice a pattern with respect to patenting? Okay, so first question, do firms patent with both? Yes, Lee.
So some of these firms are multinationals and they have both manufacturing and R&D facilities outside of the U.S.
Yeah.
Are you counting those patents?
So right now, we're only on the patent side. We're only counting a patent. We're focusing on domestic patents. So the ones.
All the inventors have to be located.
No, the assignee has to be located in the U.S. Okay. At least one assignee has to be located in the U.S. The inventor thing we make use of later when we want to assign inventors to particular plants of a firm in the United States. But I'm not going to be able to show you anything about that today. We don't now see whether you have an R&D facility abroad or whether you have an R&D facility here and you have a manufacturing facility abroad. We can't see that in the data that I've shown you, but there are ways we might be able to get at that, and so we'll pursue that later after we get this stuff out of the way. Yeah, Ben, you had a...
Can you make a distinction between process and product?
Yes, patents? Yeah, I'll show you. And it goes kind of, I think it's intuitive, but you tell me if you think it's intuitive too. Okay, so I'm going to have a very, very simple regression. Left-hand side, we got a lot of firms don't patent, a lot of zeros, lots of ways to deal with that. This is a particularly controversial way, it turns out, I suppose. I'm a big fan of ArcSign in certain contexts, maybe not this context the best, but anyway, I'm doing that for day. We could do the other stuff too. Fine, I take all those comments. The thing to notice, I'm going to run the regressions. The panel is going to be firm-level data by year, but I'm going to only use census years. Census years are every 5 years, ending in 2 and 7. So what I'm going to be looking at is what was your patent count from T to T plus 4 as a function of what was your makeup of plants in year T, as well as some other controls, X, which could be also in year T. And then I'm going to have these time, and I'll put in region fixed effects. We can add in more stuff. I'm happy to add in more stuff. It's pretty bare bones the way it is now. We're just trying to think of what the patterns are in the data. Okay, so what is a sample? All US firms. So what's the left out category? It's the other guys. Firms that have neither M nor P. And of course, all 4 types patent. But what this regression is trying to ask is, do you see some kind of excess patenting from the firms that have the 2 kinds of plants? Good on the spec? Okay, so first column, no firm fixed effects. We just use those time and region fixed effects. Here are our age bins, and here are our size bins. And then here are the three variables of interest. So the first, how do you interpret the first number? The arc sign's kind of like log points, kind of like percent, okay? So firms that have M plants patent about 4% more than firms that have neither M nor P. Second row, if you have P plants, innovation plants, that vector of plants I showed you, you patent about 2% more than if you don't have either. And then you do about 66% more if you have both. Okay, so again, descriptive regression, but pretty sizable coefficient. The size and the age controls, patents increase with firm size, not surprising, decrease with firm age. Really interesting stuff we started to play around with, like young firms innovating. Do they get bought by the older firms? So that's all coming, but that's nothing we're going to do today. Yeah.
So this is measuring under the same corporate umbrella,
Yep.
not physical distance.
Not physical distance yet. I'm going to go to that in a second. Yeah.
Bristol, that you showed, manufacturing in Puerto Rico, research in California, that counts as M&P.
Yes, but it also had, Bristol also had two plants next to each other in New Jersey that were both innovation and manufacturing. Yeah. So this is thinking about, you could think of colocation being measured not spatially, but within the umbrella of the firm, controlled by the same managers, right? Or you can think of it as spatial. And then the spatial component, again, I'm telling you stuff I'm not able to show you yet, but on the spatial side, of course, for the policy question, we're really interested in whether or not, some other firm's M is located near your P or vice versa, but none of that today. Good? So first result, okay, now let's throw in firm fixed effects, which are going to be identified by the changing mix of M and P over time. I will say parenthetically also, I've been looking at a lot of transition matrices of when are you like an M firm and then you become an MP firm, and that's super interesting. Why? Because I showed you that big decline in M that's happening, M establishments, and so which M establishments get dropped is an interesting question. Do you drop the ones far from the P? Do you drop the ones near the P? All that are interesting things to look at, but I don't have anything for you yet on that. If you throw, yes?
But as a fraction of establishments that do have manufacturing, is the P growing, the colocation of M and P within those that do have an M?
Yes, both, and I don't have that in the deck, but I have that disclosed. So the professional employment of M&P firms is growing as a share of those firms' employment. We have another paper on that. It's kind of like manufacturing firms they're losing, the manufacturing firms are losing their M, but they are adding P. And a bunch of examples we could talk about if you want. Yeah? Is it surprising that the P effect is smaller than the MP effect, or it's larger than the M effect? What do you mean? I didn't hear the end of your question, sorry. Yeah, so is that surprising? I don't know, but let's talk about that after the break. You can tell me why you think it's surprising. Okay, I guess the short answer to that would be we have to think about what are firms that have P, but not M. Yeah, exactly. So that's an interesting question. I agree as well. Okay, you asked about other kinds. So I can do manufacturing patents. Very complicated way to figure out if you know patent data, there's these CPC codes, like technology classes. There are ways to map the technology classes into NAICS codes, which tells you whether they're manufacturing. Those are concordances, so I'll say they have a lot of warts. But if you do that, you find that it's strong for manufacturing patents, not as strong for process patents. And then you could do citations. There's also breakthrough patents. There's a whole bunch of other measures out there which we will add to this analysis. So what's the main message of this slide? There is descriptively in the data, you see that the guys that have, the firms that have M and P, they tend to patent more, and you see it across the different measures that you can use. So that's the answer to the first question. Second question, now I'm going to focus in on the firms that have both and ask, does the location of those things play a role? So what do I need to do that? I need to use the geocodes. So I have to know what I'm going to do is so every firm, I know the full establishments, the full set of establishments the firm has in any year T. I can compute the distances of all the bilateral establishments that the firm has, and I can look in the subset that are just M and P, and I can look for the min across those things. If there's only one pair, it's trivial, but if there's two, or there's more than two, like in the Bristol-Myers squib, then I can look at the min, I can also look at the mean, et cetera. And I'm going to first show you something about the distribution, and then I'm going to run the regression. So this is minimum within firm distance between plants at the firm level. Every firm, I compute the min. And then for every firm, now I look across firms, what's the distribution of those mins? So the median across those firms of the mins is 3 miles, going up to 6 miles by the end of the sample period. And the mean of those mins, right, across firms is much higher, 95. So things to recall here, the firms with both M and P are a very small number of firms, but they're 80% of patents. The median is much, much smaller than, it's smaller, I shouldn't say much, much. It's smaller than the average. There's a definite skewness there. They increase over time, and remember, there's lots of M plants closing, right? But although it's increasing over time, that median distance still stays pretty small. So can't say more about that now, but I mean, that's kind of interesting. And so we're going to use this information for the second regression, and then I'll be wrapping up, to create 2 dummy variables. So, well, 3 actually, but I'll leave 1 out. So we're going to look at so firms, a firm, F, in year T, will have this dummy variable turned on if the minimum distance is between 0 and 5. Why do we pick that? If you go to industrial parks, they can be quite large. So we thought, OK, that's within like an industrial park. And then the next dummy would be within 5 and 60. We're thinking, all right, that's like within an hour's drive. So if they had to like go and visit and stuff like that, it's not such a big deal. And then the other category, since this is all M&P firms, it's anything more than 60, and that goes up pretty high. It can be hundreds of miles apart, as I alluded to with the Bristol-Myers squib example. So first, let me show you what these looks like over time, just in terms of dummy variables. Easier way to describe what's going on here. Note that these are log scales. So over the sample period, the dark line is within 5 miles. The long dashed line is that intermediate group, and the short dashed is the bigger group. And you can see in terms of numbers that most of the observations, most of the firms that are in this category have very closely located M&P plants. And they're all they're all declining slightly or whatever. They're all declining over time. Again, that's an interesting phenomena. I don't have much to say about it yet today. If you look at the patents of these groups, again, this is not surprising perhaps, given the first thing, but could be surprising, right? The guys that have, sorry, it was surprising the first time. I'm messing up the wording because I'm trying to hurry. We weren't sure how this would work out, and it is dominated by the ones that have it close together. So that seems to be a pretty strong signal of the data, again, descriptive signal from the data. Again, these are in log scales, so these are substantially higher than the, and you can see that the contribution of these 2 categories that are a bit further away, those are rising a bit faster, log scales again, so these are rising a bit faster. Again, that's probably related to these dynamics of the firms dropping their manufacturing plants over time, but still, these are increasing as well. Okay, very similar regression. I'm going to use that arcsine measure on the left. I'm going to have a dummy for within the industrial zone, a dummy for within an hour's drive, same controls that I had before, same years I had before, but now it's a much smaller set of firms. It's only the ones that are M&P. I'm going to leave out the category where you're further than 60 miles apart. And what does that look like? So again, no firm fixed effects at first, and you see that within 5 miles lights up, but there's nothing happening with the next category. Put the within firm fixed effects back, put them in. Again, there's an interesting transition matrix to look at here, which is what's going on with when you had a close one versus a far one, who's changing. I can't say anything about that yet, but we're looking at that actively, both because it's interesting and for ideas about what might be going on. And now you see both light up, and they also light up in an ordering that might make sense if you thought of this just from just introspection, right? The closer has the higher coefficient, somewhat closer has another positive coefficient, but not as high, and then those are both relative to the left out category. So again, now at this level too, the data are telling us that there seems to be this association between patents and the co-location now spatially, not just within the firm, of those 2 facilities. We can do this again with the different measures, and what do you see? So for manufacturing, again, it's highest for manufacturing patents. That might make sense. I don't know. You can also do it for process patents and citations, and again, you see a similar ordering.
So if Danny Pettit has this paper showing that the citations of firms are often by firms with whom they have higher supplier agreements.
Yeah.
And that's stronger for the patents that get lots and lots of citations.
Yeah.
So have you looked at
No, I know the paper, and we've been, yeah, it'd be interesting to talk about that paper too. I haven't seen it presented, but it's kind of interesting. Yeah, so we haven't incorporated anything like that, but we know that's going on, and that would be another way to think about colocation, right? Because colocation could have these different dimensions to it. Yeah, so that's a good point. Okay, I am out of time, but I'm just gonna give you a broader context. So I feel like Steve Jobs when I give this slide, because. Okay, so of course there's this interesting example, I'm not sure if you're like me, but there's this interesting example in my head when I'm doing this paper, which is, what about Apple? I know from public reports that Apple dropped its manufacturing plants sometime around the late 90s, 2000. And so Apple does seem to be, we think of Apple, I think, culturally and economically as a firm that's very innovative, and yet doesn't have manufacturing. And so that, what about those kinds of guys? So we have the ability to look at former manufacturing firms. And there's a little bit of a break in the presentation here. I've just shown you a message that seems M&P seem really important. But they're not the only firms that innovate. So there's this other group of firms that are non-manufacturing firms. And they're, of course, Google. So the story of the 70s till now is that the manufacturing firms were about 99% of patents in 77. They're only about 50% in 2020. So there's that other sector that's innovating, at least in terms of patents, like crazy. But then there's this interesting group subset in there, which are ones that used to be M, but are no longer M. And as we talked about in an earlier question, finding out what's going on with them is also interesting. And how does that fit with this MP stuff that I just showed you? Okay, so I don't have an answer to that, and there's this break that I recognize, but it's just too much fun not to show it to you, so I'm just going to show it to you. So you can look at former manufacturing firms. I'm going to define them as a firm that had an M sometime prior to year T in my sample, and I never see it with an M up to the end of my sample, okay? So it's not permanent, because I don't see what happens after my sample, but close enough. Okay, I can just decompose firms that way. All firms, there's most firms in the US, 4 million are non-manufacturing, that's your dry cleaner, right? And then there's a smaller set that are manufacturing, and then there's this group here, which are former manufacturing. Don't read a lot into that 0. I couldn't disclose former manufacturing going back too far. I can't disclose it because in the early days, I'm looking for firms that drop M, and there's not a lot of firms that do that, and so we're not allowed to disclose that. But they grow over time, and they have they grow in terms of their share of employment over time, and they grow in terms of their pay. So they're a kind of meaningful group of firms. And of course, Apple may be one of them. Well, I wouldn't know unless I went into the census and looked, but there's other examples, IBM, that we could talk about. So if you think about, they don't stop patenting, right? So these are manufacturing patents. These are the non-manufacturing. I'm just breaking that first line I showed you into 3. And the former manufacturing firms' patents do grow over time, and they're an interesting set of firms. And so, and you see a similar thing going on in R&D, and when we use the other data for innovation, we'll look more at that measure too. And so the thing is, I'm not going to have a big punchline with these slides, but the thing is, I want you to think, there are these former manufacturing firms. What are they doing? How are they relevant? Maybe, as Lee suggested, well, they keep their P here, and they have an M in China, or they have an M in India. That might be an interesting thing. Or maybe they become one of these like contract firms. And if you think about, broadly speaking, U.S. integration with China made whole business models possible that weren't possible before, like Roku. Where you design a good, but you don't make it, and then you send it to somebody else, but you're doing all the IP, like Apple. I'll take it in a second. Okay, so we could talk about how they trade. I'll skip over that. We could talk about the cohorts and whether or not when they became former manufacturing firms is interesting. It is. You have to wait for the next iteration. Let me conclude. So the thing I wanted you, the main message was the data seemed to pick out this association between M&P and patenting. Then there's a broader question of what happens to manufacturing firms as US structural change occurs and they drop their M. How do they do that? It could be the same message, it's just that co-location within the firm maybe matters for some things more than the spatial one. And so lots more work hopefully to come. Thanks for all your questions. And